Hey guys, Aaron here. Today we're going to be going over the front Magnaride shock replacement for 2014 and newer GM truck and SUVs. And as you may or may not know, these shocks are extremely expensive from the dealership, and the dealership charges a lot to replace them. So my goal here today is to show you guys how to do it and how to properly swap over these shocks so you can save yourself a lot of money. Now, this vehicle in particular that we're working on today is a 2016 GMC Yukon XL. Has the Z95 suspension package, which comes with the Denali. And what we're experiencing is a really rough, hard front end suspension, especially on the driver's side, which is what we're going to be working on today. It's almost like you have a brick in place of the shock, and you feel everything on the road. It's quite horrible. And by the way, there's about 92,000 miles on this SUV. And unfortunately, the job isn't as easy as removing a shock and putting in a new one. We're gonna have to do a couple more steps, but it really isn't anything big. So before we begin, let's go ahead and go over the parts and tools we're gonna need to get the job done. So we're gonna need an 18mm socket, a 15mm socket, a 1/2-inch extension, 15mm open end wrench. We're gonna need a little pick. I'll go over this in a little bit. Basically, I just ground down an Allen wrench and it worked out pretty good. Needle nose pliers, and I'm also gonna be using my 1/2-inch impact. You could use a 1/2-inch ratchet, it'll work just fine. And of course, we'll need our new AC Delco shock absorber direct from GM. And GM also recommends that we replace the nut that goes on top of the shock absorber. They say it is a one-time use, so if you remove the nut, you need to purchase a new one. I'll put both part numbers with a link in the description so you know where to buy them and how much they are. Okay, so first thing we need to do is, using a 10mm socket, disconnect the negative terminal on the battery. Alright, so with the vehicle up in the air and the tire removed, here's our shock right here. And what we need to do first is just loosen up the sway bar. We don't have to completely remove the sway bar link. We just need to loosen it using a 15mm socket and a 15mm open end wrench. So once our sway bar is loosened up, we can go ahead and remove the two 15mm bolts that hold the bottom end of the shock to the lower control arm. Alright, now that that's complete, all we have to do is remove the three top nuts on top of the coil bucket here and remove the connection for the electronic shock. Now, one thing to note, it's a little bit easier to go ahead and remove it from the top, opening the hood. You can go in through the wheel well, but you do have that fender well liner in your way. All you really need to do is push this little gray tab back on the connector of the shock, and after that we can go ahead and just pinch the back of it and it'll come undone. All right, now we can go ahead and take our 18mm with our extensions and remove all three nuts that hold the shock on. Now that everything's removed, we can go ahead and remove the shock. You don't need to remove the tie rod or the front axle here. You can simply just work the coilover off of the lower control arm and swing it out. All right, now that our shock is removed from the vehicle, we can go ahead and swap over the shock cartridge, and we're gonna reuse the spring, the isolator, the coil bucket up on top, and everything else. One thing to note, as far as compressing the spring goes, there's basically two ways you could do that. You can get a coil spring compressor kit from any auto parts store. Most of them rent them out for free. These springs have a lot of tension under them. They're probably like 600-pound springs. I really don't like to go that route just because those kits are made for lighter passenger springs in passenger cars and things like that. I have a wall-mounted spring compressor which is made for shocks that are strong just like this. It's a little bit safer and it's a little bit easier to remove the shock, and it really holds everything securely. So I'm gonna go ahead and show you how to use one of those right now and swap everything over, and then we're gonna have to swap over our connector to our new shock. And here's a better look of that connector. As you can see with our new shock does not come with that connector, so we'll have to remove the pins from that connector and just swap them over. First thing that we're going to do this swap is to mount our new shock into the spring compressor. Once we have that done, the shock will be pretty secure and we can start to compress the springs just by rotating the top, and then we can go ahead and loosen the nut that's on top of the shock itself. We don't have to compress the spring a whole lot, just enough to take the pressure off of the top mount. Using an 18mm wrench, go ahead and remove that nut. Now we can go ahead and take that shock out of the old spring, leaving the spring compressed in the spring compressor. So with our old shock removed, there are actually two pieces that we need to remove and put onto the new shock. First is this bump stop that just goes over the cylinder. Second is a small plastic washer that goes over the cylinder as well, but it's a little bit smaller and it just kind of sits on the upper portion right there. And now that our new strut's prepped to install, let's go ahead and throw it back into the spring, which is still being held by the spring compressor. And the first thing we need to do is just guide these wires on our new strut through the spring and through the upper mount. It can be a little bit difficult, but you'll get them. And once those wires are guided through properly, we can go ahead and tighten down that 18mm nut, which will fully secure the shock to the springs, and then release the tension off of the compressor, and we can take the shock off of the mount. So lastly, what we need to do is remove the old connector from the old strut and transfer it to the new strut, because the new strut doesn't have a connector. GM unfortunately doesn't supply us with one. With the back half of the connector removed, we can go ahead and remove the purple clip that is housed inside the connector itself. Using our little pick tool, all you have to do is insert the pick tool and that connector will come out. It is a little tricky at first, but with a little bit of practice, you'll get it out. And there it is. Make sure not to lose this, as we will need to reuse it. It basically just holds the wires inside the connector to make sure we have a good solid connection when we go to plug the connector into our factory harness. Next thing we need to do is just modify the pick a little bit by slightly bending it upwards. This will allow us to depress a tang inside of the connector, which will release the wires out of the connector. You'll have to fish for that little tang, but it is in there. It can be a little difficult at first, but they will come out. So with the old connector body removed from that pigtail, we can go ahead and insert the pins from our new shock into that connector. One thing that's very important is that we make sure that the pins are fully seated inside of the connector. There's a little bit of green insulation around the pins. Make sure that that green insulation is flush with the back of the connector. That way you know it's fully seated. Last step is to take our old purple clip and insert it into the connectors, which will firmly hold the wires in place. Okay, so first thing we need to do is just put our connection back together. Once the connector is fully seated, go ahead and take your yellow tab and just push it all the way in, ensuring that the connection is good and tight. Now we can go ahead and put the 3 nuts back on top, securing the shock in place. Once you get everything bolted back together, put the wheel back on and take it for a test drive. This thing definitely rides a lot better with that new shock in. Also, make sure to check the links in the description for the parts and tools I used during this video. Thanks for watching as always, guys. See you next time.